Greetings, and welcome to the 2020 Civic Engagement Public Speaking Contest hosted by Penn State University's Department of Communication Arts and Sciences. This contest is hosted every year to acknowledge and recognize the strongest students who are taking our introductory public speaking class. This is a contest that requires students to advance through multiple rounds, beginning with a nomination from their class, to a preliminary round where they compete against fellow competitors and are judged and ranked, to a semifinal round, and finally to the final round, which is what you're watching now. And so to honor this very difficult and important achievement, I wanted to begin by having a brief announcement from our Lieutenant Governor, John Fetterman, who would like to share a note of congratulations to the competitors.
Hey, it's Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman. I just wanted to take this opportunity to congratulate each and every one of the winners for the public speaking competition. You know, it's a skill that I admittedly can always work on myself. So the fact that you're already excelling, this early in life, I think is going to ultimately serve you very, very well. Whether it's in public service, whether it's in education, whether it's in technology, whatever career path you ultimately choose, this skill is going to pay dividends for the rest of your life.
So, as Lieutenant Governor Fetterman noted in his brief note of congratulations, this is a very difficult contest for anybody in any time, but it's especially difficult for people in a very beginning public speaking class who are trying to participate in a contest amid a massive global pandemic that has disrupted so much of our daily lives. A lot has changed during the pandemic as a result of the ways that we have to social distance and maintain public health regulations. And that is spanned from very small ways, from, for example, some of us growing our hair out, to very large ways where people have had to make significant changes in their academic schedules, to the point where people are grappling with their own health challenges, as well as mourning people in their families who have been struggling with the epidemic. And so there are a lot of major pressures that people are facing right now. And as a result, those pressures have changed the format of this contest. Typically, the contest would take place in a very large auditorium where you would have hundreds of people in the audience watching and observing and applauding and giving people congratulations. This year, we've changed that for purposes of health safety. And so this year, our competitors submitted individual videos, and those videos were then watched and ranked by judges asynchronously, participating from wherever they happened to be and wherever was convenient for them. And so with that change, I would like to encourage audiences who are watching to keep in mind that the students, in many cases, re-recorded their videos on their own at home with their own technology after returning after Thanksgiving break. And so the formats and the structure of the videos, in order to showcase students' different presentation aids and visuals, as well as their own presentation skills and delivery, are going to look a little bit different from one another, and that's okay. We'd like you to focus mainly on the presentation itself as you think about the strengths of these contestants, as well as consider their arguments and how they advance their ideas. And so I want to also note that before we start, we'd like to thank a few people. One of the people we'd like to thank is Jeff Nagel, who is the Assistant Director of the CAS 100 program and has gone to great lengths to reorganize this contest and adapt it after years of it being an in-person contest to a digital format. And the time and energy and effort that he's put into that has been immense, and we appreciate him immensely. I would secondly like to acknowledge all of the CAS faculty who have volunteered their time and energies to nominate students, encourage their participation, and for them to, and who have taken their own time to judge and participate in making this contest work. And then finally, I'd like to thank people such as Emily Bush-Clark, who works in our administrative office and has been instrumental in helping us think about logistics for moving this contest online. From there, I also want to thank our guest judges who are judging this final round. And so at the time you're watching this video, they've actually already watched the speeches, analyzed them, and evaluated them. But I want to take a moment to thank them for the great amount of time and energy and work they put into watching these speeches, really strongly considering those speeches' strengths and offering their responses. So the first person I'd like to recognize is Dr. Nancy Metzger, someone who earned her BA, MA, and PhD from the Department of Communication Arts and Sciences in 1969, 71, and 74, respectively. She is a retired organizational developmental consultant with the Mount Carmel Health System, She designed and delivered communication-based programs for employees, and most recently, she focused on conflict resolution, team building, coaching, and managing change and transition. She's also someone who serves as an active volunteer in the community, primarily working on health therapy, using pet therapy with people who are in hospice care. And finally, most notably for our department, she endowed the Dr. Nancy J. Metzger Award, which is a major award that supports and sustains our department. Our next judge is Dr. Abraham Khan, a professor in the Department of Communication Arts and Sciences. Dr. Khan is someone who studies the intersection of protest and sport, and he looks at the way that concepts of civic engagement and African American politics and social life have evolved over time, with a focus on those Black athletes who have taken up the mantle of social protest. And so what he often does with his work is he connects historical trajectories, so from people such as Richard Sherman today to the antecedents or precedents for their sports activism. For example, people like Jackie Robinson. And so he's someone who's passionate about the study of advocacy and how to support an argument and the different ways that people make appeals, and so is a great person to judge this contest. A third judge is Barbara Cohen, another alumnus of our program. She received her BA from CAS in 1974 and an MBA from the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. She is a recently retired president and founder of Canon Consulting, which is a marketing and strategy consulting firm that provides advice to businesses and nonprofit organizations, particularly in times of market disruption. And so she's someone who brings a great deal of communication expertise as she watches these speeches. She's also been very active in her support for the university. She serves on the Women in Leadership panel at Penn State. She was alongside her husband, has helped to establish the Cohen-Schwartz Renaissance Fund, a trustee scholarship, and a Paterno Fellows Program scholarship. And finally, she was named a Penn State Alumni Fellow in 2016, as well as a member of the Alumni Society Board of Directors for the College of Liberal Arts. So she's very active and involved, and we appreciate the time that she puts into so much of what our university does, including this contest. And finally, our fourth judge is Dr. Jen Shook. She is a visiting fellow in Penn State's Center for Humanities and Information. She looks at the relationship of performance, literature, critical race studies, and digital culture. And she's also an artist and creator in her own right, working in media ranging from paper to puppets to digital humanities work. And so as someone who has worked in the field of digital humanities, she's someone who I think is a very fitting judge to consider this first contest that we're hosting digitally. And so, with that introduction of our four judges, I would like to now provide one last note before we get into the main event. And that is that if you are watching the first broadcast of this live, be sure to follow along and live tweet. You can follow along at the hashtag SpeechPSU, and starting at the beginning of the contest, I will, one, be making self-deprecating notes about myself as I talk, and two, we will also be talking about the various performers and the strengths of their speeches, and you're welcome to add any comments to that conversation that you'd like. And so, on that note, I would like us to move on to the contest itself. And so before each speech, either I or the instructor that works with the student in CAS 100 will provide a brief introduction. Our first competitor is Lauren Halstead-Willett. Lauren is a third-year student who is majoring in astrophysics. She is from Duxbury, Massachusetts, where she lives by the beach with her mother, her two brothers, and her dog Luna. She researches young stars, she collects antiques, and she loves to paint. And she hopes to do some sort of volunteering for a year after graduation before moving on to get a PhD in astrophysics. And so, without further ado, let us please congratulate and welcome Lauren.
Hi, everyone. So if you've been watching the news lately, you may have heard about the wildfires that have been raging through Colorado's Rocky Mountain National Park. And according to the Washington Post, the three largest wildfires in the state's history have all happened this year, and I haven't even brought up California yet. So science has made it clear that climate change is a present problem rather than a future one. And a promising method for combating climate change relies on using the market economy, which is a key cause of climate change, as a part of the solution. So I'm advocating for a federal carbon tax as the most direct and equitable solution to the climate change issue. I will be discussing the scientific causes and implications of climate change, the role of the economy in perpetuating the issue, and then why a federal carbon tax is such a powerful solution. So the reality of climate change and its direct physical causes have been understood for decades. And according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there is a greater than 95% chance that the warming of the planet has been caused by the human burning of fossil fuels from the 1900s onwards. And as a result, NASA has found that the global temperature has on average risen by about 2.05 degrees Fahrenheit, which may not seem like much, but this can have a drastic effect on our delicate climate balance. So for example, NASA has listed some of the more general effects on the planet as a warming and more acidic ocean, shrinking ice sheets, sea level rise, heat waves, droughts, and more extreme storms. And then there are also some more regional US specific effects, including compromised infrastructure, erosion, wildfires, more insect outbreaks and tree diseases, decreased air quality, and decreased agricultural yield. And all of these issues will tend to disproportionately affect those who cannot afford to relocate or who cannot afford rising food prices. And part of the issue is that taxes normally directed towards these individuals are needing to be diverted towards basic damage control. So, for example, the National Interagency Fire Center found that in 2018, the US spent a record of $3 billion just on fire suppression alone. So there's dwindling skepticism that climate change is a problem, and there have been numerous innovations meant to circumvent the issue, like alternative energy. So why in 2020 is this still such a huge problem? So one idea is this thing called market failure. And market failure, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, is essentially when the market economy does not produce the most efficient or beneficial result for society as a whole. And it's essentially the reason why governments do have to regulate corporations. And it also has an individual component. So, for example, somebody might agree that climate change is a problem, but they might not think about it when they're just filling up their gas tank in the morning. So, if the economy perpetuates the climate change problem, though, it can also become the solution. And in fact, it has been called the invisible hand by economists because of the powerful effects that the economy can have on societal behavior. Now, there is no direct carbon tax anywhere in the US, but the idea has gained significant traction. And according to Bloomberg Businessweek, around 50 countries in the world use a direct carbon tax. And the idea behind the carbon tax really is that polluters pay directly for the pollution that they cause. And this would be something that would be mandated by the federal government because this is a national problem, but then it could be enforced by the states since they have historically enforced all other sales taxes. And it really would just be a price per ton of carbon. So a tax could be placed, for example, on gasoline, natural gas, and even things like concrete. Now, regarding these specific numbers, there's this useful article published by Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy back in August. And it's called Net Term to Net Zero, and it effectually involves selecting a target year for net zero emissions, and then a gradual tax is developed based off of that. So for reference, a 2050 net zero goal would result in a tax of about 45 cents per gallon of gasoline in 2025. Now, establishing a carbon tax can become a politically delicate process, and numerous stakeholders do need to be considered here. So first off, it's important to consider low-income individuals and also those who proportionally spend more on fossil fuels. So for example, people who commute to work a lot. And this is where the importance of a gradual tax really comes in. And it might also be useful if the tax is accompanied by dividends of equal amounts back to US citizens, which would essentially make it a progressive tax and revenue neutral enough to appeal to those who advocate for a smaller federal government. Now, at this point, one might ask, What on earth is the point of taking money from consumers only to just return it? And the simple answer to that question is that people respond to price tags on things like gasoline. Now, that may sound strange, but according to Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission, in this article they published called Clearing the Air, they evaluated British Columbia's 2008 revenue neutral carbon tax. And despite it being revenue neutral, by 2015, their emissions were around 5 to 15% lower than they otherwise would have been. Now, another stakeholder are those who work in the fossil fuel industry. And this is where it's important that money not returned through dividends is diverted towards the creation of renewable energy jobs. Finally, it's important to consider fossil fuel industry and the companies, which might seem like you could just slap a heavy fee on them, but then they could just simply take their business and jobs elsewhere. But in fact, plenty of companies actually do support a carbon tax. So for example, all of these companies here are part of this group called the Climate Leadership Council that advocates for a carbon tax. And the reason that they advocate for it, according to Vox.com, is essentially that these companies are regularly inundated by lawsuits regarding their damage to the climate. And their hope is that a carbon tax will provide some sort of semblance of protection from these lawsuits in exchange for a more predictable penalty. So considering all of that, I have discussed the scientific causes of climate change and its effects, the role of economics in perpetuating the problem, and how a carbon tax can act as a direct and equitable solution. Now, I want to end off by reiterating one important thing, which is that we as US citizens are paying for climate change whether we institute a carbon tax or not. It is just a matter of whether we are paying for prevention or for damage. And only one option will secure our future. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you all for watching the 2020 Penn State Civic Engagement Public Speaking Contest. My name is Brad Serber, and I'm an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Communication Arts and Sciences. And it's my pleasure to introduce you all to my student Jeremy Schooler, who's going to be talking about admitting Washington, D.C. as the 51st U.S. state. Jeremy grew up in Washington, D.C., so this is an issue that affects him personally, and you'll see in his speech that it's an issue that he cares an awful lot about. He also attributes some of his success in public speaking to his time spent working on a local radio show, so there's a fun fact you might not know about him. I want to wish Jeremy luck and wish luck to all of the contestants in this year's contest. I know from helping to coordinate this event a few years ago just how hard you all work and how much time and energy goes into these speeches, and you all should be very proud of yourselves. So with that, I want to wish Jeremy luck, and I hope you all enjoy his speech. Washington deserves a voice. Why the federal government should admit Washington, D.C. as the 51st state. Thanks.
Washington, D.C. is one of the fastest growing cities in the entire country, is home to the federal level of each branch of the U.S. government, and is home to 700,000 residents, the majority of whom are U.S. citizens. It's a city that's relevant in the lives of almost every American, but what you might not know is that these 700,000 citizens in Washington, D.C. are denied rights that nearly all other Americans are entitled to. Rights such as Senate and House voting representation, as well as, of course, statehood. I'm proposing that Congress admit D.C. as the 51st state and end 2 centuries of disenfranchisement. To persuade Congress and my fellow citizens of this, I will explain the negatives of the current situation, solutions to alleviate concerns of those against D.C. statehood, and explain why it is in the best interest of the country. D.C. has faced many injustices over this country's founding. Many of them have been righted over the past 200 years. Statehood is not. D.C.'s population is actually larger than 2 states, Wyoming and Vermont, as well as on par with 3 others, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Alaska. These states, however, all receive Senate and House representation, while D.C. has no Senate representation and just 1 non-voting House member. The D.C. City Council, the legislative arm of the local D.C. city government, has said that despite the limited rights enjoyed by its citizens, D.C. residents pay the highest per capita income tax in the entire country. D.C. is famous for its license plates that read, "End taxation without representation." This Congress that D.C. had no say in creating and who works in their city can overturn any law that the D.C. City Council creates. Due to archaic and racist principles, Congress stripped D.C. of its local government when Reconstruction ended in the 1870s. History Network political journalist Becky Little has cited that this was mostly because D.C., which is a heavily minority city, had many black men becoming more involved in the political process through voting, campaigning, and running for office, and many openly racist members of Congress were against this and worked together to stunt D.C.'s growth politically among minorities, which they did by stripping D.C. of its local government. In the civil rights era in the mid-1900s, D.C. was able to obtain voting rights for president. Until 1964, no one in D.C., regardless of age, race, religion, gender, or anything else, could ever vote for president. More progress came in the 70s when D.C. earned home rule, the right to a mayor, and a non-voting member of Congress. However, of course, Congress can still overturn any law that the D.C. City Council creates. According to John Hudak, the Deputy Director at the Center for Effective Public Management, D.C. has pushed for statehood formally since 1980, and Eleanor Holmes Norton, their non-voting congresswoman, has brought bills forth to the House very often since then. This past June, in a historic vote, House Resolution 51, the D.C. Admission Act brought forth by Norton and Congressman Steny Hoyer of Maryland, was passed. The first time a D.C. statehood bill has ever been passed in either chamber of Congress. The Senate has still never voted on it. It's no secret that D.C. is a very liberal city. They voted Democrat in every election since 1964, including the two elections, 1972 and 1984, in which Republicans won, Presidents Nixon and Reagan, with 49 states. D.C. still voted Democrat, with the one state that didn't. The following themes have been very relevant in our country the past few months: systemic racism, voter suppression, voter disenfranchisement, political involvement in general. Americans have shown that they want to protest and fight on behalf of their fellow Americans who are denied basic rights. This is a prime example of that. President Trump has said repeatedly that he's anti-DC statehood, while President-elect Joe Biden, who will take office in January, has said, quote, "I have been pro-DC statehood for 28 years. In last month's election, Democrats maintained control of the House, and pending two runoff elections in the Senate, could gain control of the Senate. It's possible in 2021 that we have a pro-statehood House, Senate, and White House." After House Resolution 51, Congressman Steve Daines of Montana, Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, and Tom Cotton of Arkansas spoke passionately on the Senate floor against D.C. statehood. They cited two main reasons: the Residence Act of 1790, which states D.C. must be a neutral authority, so no state has undue influence upon it. My proposal, as well as Congresswoman Norton's, House Resolution 51, would not give D.C. any undue influence because all federal buildings would remain in a federal district so as to give no undue influence or bias to any one state. D.C., the state of District of Columbia, would be the residential areas and all areas outside of federal buildings specifically. Another issue that these congressmen brought forth was the issue of diluting their state's influence. However, their states, such as Montana, Arkansas, and to a lesser extent South Carolina, are very low in population, yet still have two senators, the same as California, Texas, Florida, New York, and any other heavily populated states. So really, in fairness, they are outweighing their value in terms of the amount of people in their states compared to states with much larger populations. The fact that D.C. would likely always have Democrat senators really shouldn't come into play. As a state, and as 700,000 citizens living in that state, they deserve two senators. According to Susan Rice, National Security Advisor under President Obama, the most common reasons for opposition against D.C. statehood are D.C. being too small and D.C. should having to retrocede back to Maryland, which is where D.C. was formed from. However, the Maryland government has shown no desire for this to happen, and according to a referendum in Maryland in 2016, the Washington City paper has said the results. In 2016, this referendum, 44% of Marylanders were against retroceding D.C. back to Maryland, and only 28% were for. Also, there is no law or legislation anywhere in the U.S. Constitution or anywhere else that mandates a minimum size geographically for a state, so D.C.'s geographic size really is not relevant. Despite many milestones achieved by D.C. and those working on behalf of it since this country's founding, there's still a long way to go. D.C. may have home rule, there's limitations to that. It may have a mayor, there's only limitations to her power. Statehood is the final piece that Washington and Americans deserve. 2021 is a year that we could have a pro-statehood House, Senate, and Congress, and this is the year, in this socio-political climate, then Congress should give 700,000 Americans the right they deserve and make Washington, D.C. the 51st state. 51st star. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Yue Li, a doctoral student in Communication Arts and Sciences and instructor of CAS 100A. It is my pleasure to introduce my student, Hannah Gersbowski, in the final round of this contest. In 2020, a year full of moments that mandate us to reckon with the various injustices in our society, knowing how to confront and address biases in our relationships, communities, and social systems has never been more important. In her insightful and kairotic presentation, Hannah tackles implicit bias in our community of Penn State. I hope you enjoy Hannah's extensive research, sound reasoning, and dynamic delivery as much as I did. Thank you.
Did you know even judges, the people we most expect to demonstrate fair, objective opinions, are biased? Everyone holds stereotypes that unconsciously affect their behaviors, decisions, and lives. These stereotypes that we unconsciously hold but cannot actively recall are called implicit biases. They can become a problem as we may project values that don't even align with our own beliefs and bring others down in the process. What do I mean by that? Someone may be speaking of a scientist. Let's call this person Dr. Johnson. I can tell you that Dr. Johnson is a world-renowned physicist doing cutting-edge research on nuclear physics and is the head of a huge corporation. Who are you picturing right now? Did you think of Dr. Johnson as a minority? Did you consider the possibility of Dr. Johnson being a woman? If you didn't picture Dr. Johnson like this, and I asked you why, would you be able to give an explanation? When we unconsciously associate people with certain attributes, we are demonstrating implicit bias. As Penn Staters, we value community, helping one another, and putting our best foot forward. We have an opportunity to make Penn State an even better environment than what it already is and send our alumni out into the world better equipped to improve it. I propose that we integrate implicit bias training into freshman courses for all students. But before examining a solution, we must understand implicit biases and its causes. Implicit bias is a stereotype or association that we hold subconsciously but cannot recall. As published in University of Denver's Microaggressions in the Classroom article, it can take the form of brief verbal and environmental indignities, insensitivity, or negating the feelings and experiences of a certain person or group. When we express our implicit biases, we create an unwelcoming environment, and the negative effects propagate onward. In his publication, College Teaching, educational researcher Guy Boysen described how 63% of students witness subtle bias in the classroom. Through these experiences, students who witness implicit bias perceive campus climate negatively, have physical and psychological health stress, and can experience an inability to exert cognitive effort in the classroom. This means implicit bias is a widespread problem in education and likely presents itself here at Penn State, which unfortunately means our students may not be in the best possible environment they can. Overall, our peers' health, grades, and lives could be better if it weren't for implicit bias. That's not to say implicit bias doesn't affect our professors as well. In addition to these effects, professors also witness problems due to implicit bias in teacher ratings. Colleen Flaherty, a reporter for Inside Higher Education, provided experimental research on the effects of gender bias on student-teacher evaluations at Iowa State. The research showed that gender bias against women made female professor ratings lower than male professor ratings. However, when language cautioning about unconscious bias of race and gender was used in the instructions for the evaluation, female professor ratings went up, while male professor ratings remained the same. This raises the question, are our faculty being evaluated, hired, and promoted on the basis of biases we, as students, don't consciously hold? What causes this implicit bias? From a young age, we look for patterns, whether that be in shapes or in people. Simply Psychology's article on implicit or unconscious bias explains that recognizing patterns and creating associations is how our brain lessens the cognitive load of the surroundings. Psychologist Mahzarin Banaji, who helped come up with the theory of implicit bias in 1995, further explained the roots of implicit bias in an interview with NPR, stating, "Implicit bias is in the culture in which we live. There is a culture that has led men to being surgeons and women being nurses. If you had lived in a culture where the opposite happened, you would have the opposite bias. Overall, we develop biases by taking in information and forming inaccurate associations as shortcuts. These biases are then reinforced through constant exposure of events or media portrayals that match. So how can we use this habitual pattern of our brains to our advantage? By introducing and repetitively reinforcing the negative effects of implicit bias, we could become more aware of our own implicit biases as well as our peers. Penn State can implement implicit bias training in the first-year seminar courses and engagement plans. Over the span of the course, students will first receive a presentation defining what implicit bias is and how it occurs. They will then participate in discussions where they can share either experienced or witnessed implicit bias personally or in the media. As a tool to help students recognize where they may hold implicit bias, students will take Harvard's implicit bias test online. Results can be kept to themselves, and an anonymous reporting system can be used to give general data to course instructors. In having students see their results from this test, there may be concern about students responding defensively to results suggesting they have bias. This is a valid concern that we would try to minimize through two preparations at the beginning of the course. The first being the original exposure presentation, emphasizing how implicit bias does not necessarily align with our views. The second, having the prior discussions with peers about experiences of implicit bias to see how widespread it is, and even exhibited in respectable people. Furthermore, the implicit bias test is already used for similar reasons in some courses, such as SC 220, a pedagogy class for learning assistants in STEM at Penn State. On the PBS website, in an article entitled "Making People Aware of Their Implicit Biases Doesn't Usually Change Minds," Betsy Mason pointed out that revealing to people that they have implicit bias does not mitigate it in the long run. For this reason, after revealing where people may have implicit biases, students will also be informed on how to address implicit bias effectively and respectfully. In his research, Boysen also explained how actively addressing occurrences of implicit bias in the classroom, as opposed to just ignoring them, makes for a more positive learning environment and helps to squander the presence of implicit bias. Students can practice this using the tools of effectively addressing implicit bias they learned in the course. This practicing will in turn help students more naturally become aware of implicit bias, and it will become more absent in the classroom. In order to reach this end goal of minimizing implicit bias at Penn State, this discussion is just the beginning. We need to recognize that implicit bias negatively affects grades, evaluations, and the health of people who comprise our Penn State community. This problem may have begun outside of Penn State when we were young, but we now have the opportunity to help resolve it by educating our students on implicit bias. I propose we implement implicit bias training in first-year seminar courses and engagement activities. We are Penn State. Let's ensure that everyone feels like they are included in we. Let's stop implicit bias. Thank you.
Hello again. I hope that you're enjoying the contest so far. I would like to take a brief moment to introduce our next competitor, Chris Long. Chris is a student in David Dazowski's CAS 100 course, and he is a senior double major in meteorology and geography, and is also the president of the College of Earth and Mineral Sciences Student Council. And so very, very impressive scientific career that he anticipates. He hopes to learn how to better synthesize the social scientific research about how people make sense of meteorological messages with the work that is actually done by scientists to try to sort of better improve communication around meteorology. And that's something that he's passionate about. He plans on pursuing a graduate degree at the intersection of the two disciplines of meteorology and geography with a focus on that goal. He's also an avid swimmer since age 7 and is a member of Penn State's club team for swimming. And so he's someone who will now tell you a little bit about a topic that he is passionate about.
According to the National Hurricane Center, between 1963 and 2012, 76% of all tropical storm and hurricane-related deaths occurred due to water. Now, this is an alarming statistic, and it highlights a problem that we have in this country, and that's the fact that there are unnecessary deaths occurring to tropical cyclones and hurricanes in the United States. Now, to solve this problem, I'm proposing that the National Hurricane Center should switch their scale that they use to define the severity level of a hurricane, and my new scale would, instead of the normal category 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 that you are used to, would rank hurricanes as either a hurricane if it's currently a category 1 or 2 on the scale, or a major hurricane if it's a category 3, 4, or 5. So for the rest of this speech, I'll talk about why I believe we should move to this new scale, and I believe that, and I'll talk about the vulnerability to flooding that we have in this country. I'll talk about the current scale, a little bit of a history of it, and also its current downfalls. Then finally, I'll move to my new scale that I'm proposing and why I believe this will help curb these unnecessary deaths. So let's talk about what makes a hurricane so dangerous. And as I was saying earlier, there's the statistic here that 76% of all storm-related deaths in the United States between 1963 and 2012 occur due to water. We can see that here. 49% of deaths occur due to storm surge, which is when we have the water from the ocean coming up and flooding the coastal areas because of the strong winds associated with the hurricane. And then the other 27% comes due to rain, and what that really is just inland flooding. Now, you might look at this statistic and you might say, well, 1963 to 2012, is this really still relevant? Well, the answer is unfortunately, yes, it is. In 2016, Hurricane Matthew made landfall in North Carolina, and due to its extensive flooding, there were 25 deaths total from the storm. 24 of those were associated with flooding. In 2017, Hurricane Harvey made landfall in Texas. There were 68 deaths in Texas. Unfortunately, 65 of them were due to flooding. So the point is, water kills more than anything else in a tropical cyclone. The other problem is the United States is becoming more vulnerable to flooding. From 1990 to 2018, according to the National Hurricane Center, of all the counties that touch the Gulf of Mexico, they've had a 32% increase in population density. Likewise, the counties that touch the Atlantic Ocean had a 17% increase in population density in that time. And most of these locations are less than 10 feet above sea level, meaning that they're very vulnerable to this, especially the storm surge flooding. So the more people we have in these areas, the more potential we have for destruction and for loss of life. And finally, I think the most jarring problem we have is that the public's view of severity isn't really based on water. It's based on one statistic, and that is wind. And we hear this often from broadcast meteorologists who have a lot of interactions with the general public when talking about the weather. We've heard from Ed Piotrowski, who is a chief meteorologist at a TV station in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. When talking about Hurricane Florence, he said, and I quote, "When Florence weakened from a category 4 to a category 1, there was a collective sigh of relief from our viewers that they weren't going to be getting hit as hard." Jack Brevins, who's a senior hurricane specialist at the National Hurricane Center, also echoed the same sentiments. He said, there were a lot of people that took their eyes off of the rain when Florence went to a category 1. Now, if you know anything about Hurricane Florence, it had historic flooding after making landfall in northern South Carolina in 2018. There were 23 deaths associated with this storm. 17 of them were due to flooding. And I think this was put best by Leslie Chapman, who's the president and CEO of the Federal Alliance of Safe Homes. He said, we, talking about the meteorological community, we know it's all about water, but no one else does. So why is it? Is the public so focused on wind and not water, which is the most hazardous portion of the storm? The answer comes because of the severe Simpson hurricane scale, which is the current system that the National Hurricane Center uses to rank the severity of storms in the Eastern Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. And to give you a slight history of this scale, it was developed in the 1970s. This is all according to the National Park Service by Herbert Saphir, who was an engineer, and Robert Simpson, who is a meteorologist. And their goal was to create a system to potentially give the amount of destruction that could occur due to a hurricane if it were to make landfall. And they based all of their decision making off of one variable, and that was wind. So any storms that had wind speeds greater than 74 miles per hour were considered a hurricane. And then they came up with the category system that we all know so well on the 1 through 5 scale. But the problem is what I just talked about. We all know that category system so well, but this category system only talks about the wind speed. It doesn't talk about water, which is, as I just showed you, the most dangerous portion of a tropical cyclone. We also can talk about these impactful storms that had a low category number when they landfall. Hurricane Sandy, when it made landfall in New York City in 2012, was only a tropical storm. It wasn't even a hurricane. But if you're from coastal New Jersey, coastal New York, you undoubtedly know about Hurricane Sandy because it made more than $68 million in damages. That's 5th all time for tropical cyclones in the United States. Likewise, Hurricane Florence, which I was talking about a little bit earlier with the broadcast meteorologist, it made landfall in South Carolina as a Category 1 storm, but ultimately there was more than $24 million in damages from this storm. Again, one of the more costlier storms of all time. So the point is, hurricanes can be extremely dangerous and have a low category number. So now that we understand the downfalls in the severe Simpson hurricane scale, let's talk about why I want to move to a new system, and let's talk about what that new system would be. So my new system would get rid of the severe Simpson hurricane scale and instead call storms either a hurricane if it's currently a Category 1 or 2 storm, or a major hurricane if it's currently a 3, 4, or 5. And the point of this is to take away the emphasis from the wind speed and allow the Hurricane Center, for whichever storm it is, to talk about the specific hazards associated with that specific storm, because every storm ultimately is different. Now, of course, putting this into action would take a lot of work, and the Weather Service would have to go through all of the work that it would normally do when it decides to change an advisory or something like that. I would have to talk to its core partners, which include emergency managers, the Weather Service forecasters themselves, the general public, broadcast meteorologists, everybody like that. And they would put out surveys to make sure that people like this change and that they're okay with this change. And then once those surveys were accepted, if people were ultimately in favor of this, the Weather Service would have to put on workshops for its own meteorologists. They would have to put on workshops for emergency managers, for broadcast meteorologists. We would have to have broadcast meteorologists put out public service announcements so that the public is aware of this new system. But ultimately, if we have to do all this work and it saves one life, I think that means it was worth it. So in summary, there's unnecessary deaths happening due to tropical cyclones in the United States. To solve this problem, we need to change the hurricane scale so that people are less obsessed with that one variable of wind, and it allows the Weather Service to talk about those other hazards that might be more dangerous for each specific storm. The National Weather Service's mission is to save lives and property. By changing the hurricane rating scale, they can do that for their own country.
Hi, I'm Lori Schneider, and I have the pleasure to introduce Gabriel Gonsalves, a charming student I've had the delight of having in class this semester. Gabriel's been one of the best performing students from the beginning of the semester and very clever at adapting to this novel pandemic situation. He knew he could go to Thomas and find the quietest rooms with the least distractions and the very best Wi-Fi. He often zoomed in a little early and chatted with me and the other students. From these interactions, we all learned how much he cared about what's happening in the world. In fact, he plans on serving his country after graduating by commissioning into the Marine Corps in the PLC program, which is a little bit different than the NROTC. Well, here at Penn State, he's currently a sophomore in SMEAL marketing and is a member of the FSAE team, known as the Formula Racing Team, and he's very active with photography as well. I've learned that he's also fluent in both English and Portuguese. Please extend a warm welcome to Gabriel Gonsalves. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Today, I'm going to be speaking to you about the US J-1 visa legislation and how it is completely ineffective when applied to a world where COVID-19 is a reality. Now, can you imagine being stranded in a foreign country with no way of getting home and no way to sustain yourself? Personally, that sounds like a nightmare. Unfortunately, for a close friend of mine, that nightmare actually became her reality. Now, I will be explaining how illegal immigration is a large problem here in the United States, no doubt, and it is taken extremely seriously. Compared to many other countries, it is looked down upon with the utmost scrutiny. One of the solutions our government has come up with is that we make visas extremely hard to obtain. As it stands, the United States gives out 300,000 of these visas per year only. In comparison, I know that would completely fill up the Beaver Stadium 3 times over. Yes, that might sound like a lot, and yes, 100%, it would make for the best whiteout ever, but it's still extremely selective. However, it doesn't account for many possibilities, some of which we're going to be speaking about today. Firstly, as US citizens, we rarely face any trouble when looking for visas. I mean, seriously, the US passport will get you into basically any country you would want to visit in the first place. But let's put ourselves in other people's shoes for just a sec and understand the absolute hell that is visa application process. For this policy, we're going to be looking specifically into one category of visas, and that is the exchange visitor visa, also known as a J1 visa. Now, as stated on the exchange visitors page of the US Citizenship and Immigration Services website, it is, quote, a non-immigrant visa, that category that seeks to approve individuals to participate in a study or work-based exchange program. It doesn't account for COVID-19 or the effects it's had on air travel, leaving many people stranded past their visa date with no option to work legally. Personally, I have a close friend that went through this exact same situation and was left months stranded here in the United States. Now let's look further into and understand the intricacies that come along with this legislation. Personally, just the thought of it is scarier than the Sunday scaries. Firstly, as stated on the eligibility section of the Bridge USA website, it is, quote, in order to be eligible, participants must be between the ages of 15 and 18 on the first day of school if they're coming to study. Now, for older participants, it's quite different. A standing job offer is needed to apply in the first place. A company based in the United States will sponsor the visa and promise the government basically that the visa holder will have a job upon arrival, ensuring that they in fact come with the actual intent of working. If laid off, of course, the visa can be rescinded and they're given a certain time period to leave the country. Now, let's look at how long you can stay in country with this visa. Funny enough, as everything else with this legislation, it depends. And this time, it depends specifically on what exact program you apply for. In my friend's case, it allowed for 30 days of travel around the United States after 70 days of employment. Her employment happened to be at a summer sleepaway camp. In other words, she got to work during the summer and then travel about midway through September. According to the Exchange Visitor Program page of the State Department and Consular Affairs website, this legislation states that if something were to happen to her flight, maybe it got canceled or maybe it got pushed back, which it ended up being, it would allow for a grace period where they wouldn't be considered illegal until the rescheduled flight. Unfortunately, it assumes that that will take place at most maybe 15 days afterwards, when in fact, because of COVID-19 and how it has affected the air industry in general, rescheduled flights, especially to Australia, where she was from, were far and few in between. In my friend's case, it got actually moved from September 15th all the way to October 25th. That's more than a month. It's crazy. Here lies a capping issue with this legislation. It allows for visitors to be completely stranded here in the United States by no fault of their own, and even potentially end up in the streets for lack of funds because they can't work legally. Now, I have a proposal that would seek to effectively solve this issue while providing safe borders and accounting for illegal immigration. This clause would need to be active considering this type of situation, but how do we do that while making sure we're not providing for loopholes and for those wanting to come into the country illegally? Well, my clause would change, or better still, add to the grace period legislation attached to the J1 visa. It would state that after the completion of your program, you have 30 days to depart the United States. However, if by no fault of your own, you are not able to do so, you will be considered a legal alien until you have your first chance to leave. I got this from the employment under the J1 visa page in the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services website. Now, my clause would add the following. If you are not able to leave up to 30 days after the end of your grace period, the J1 visa holder will be allowed to temporarily seek employment to sustain themselves. Said employment shall be terminated before the first chance the holder has to exit the country. The agency one would have to appeal to, so that this could be put in place in the first place, would be Congress. I would expect, obviously, some pushback from the political right, as it deals very intimately with illegal immigration. In other words, my solution would be to take into account and provide solutions to avoid illegal immigration in the first place. I also believe that with the incoming administration, it would be safe to say that there's a slightly more favorable environment for this clause. To conclude, this is how I believe we can really easily solve an issue that leaves thousands of people in dire situations for no reason at all. As it stands, 300,000 people have the possibility to be in this situation every year, not being able to work or sustain themselves, many times relying on just a summer's worth of salary, if they were smart enough to save. All of them could potentially be left with no possibilities other than working illegally to keep themselves off the street. Ironically, if they were caught in doing so and deported, that would actually be faster than the rescheduled flight. Let's make this right and provide for a clause that will allow for the best possible cultural experience visitors can get here in the United States in even worse situations like this pandemic. Thank you for listening, and I appreciate your support.
Hi, my name is Robin Kramer, and this semester I had the pleasure of teaching Catherine Bennis, our next speaker. Catherine comes from Hingham, Massachusetts, and she's currently a junior studying acting in Penn State School of Theater. Upon graduation, she hopes to continue in the arts and with storytelling. So I invite you this evening to watch and listen to her policy speech. And without further ado, let's welcome Catherine Bennis.
If I start talking about tampons right now, how uncomfortable would you feel? My guess is pretty uncomfortable. But despite how uncomfortable tampons may make you, there is something about them that we seriously need to talk about. What's in them? In the United States, there are no federal laws requiring that tampon manufacturers disclose their ingredients. We can know the ingredients in our aspirin, our makeup, or even our pizza rolls, but not our tampons. Why is that? Why are tampons less likely to hold unsafe ingredients than these products? The answer is they aren't. Therefore, it's time that we get clear about what exactly is in our tampons. And in order to do so, I am arguing that we fight for a federal law ensuring that tampon manufacturers disclose their ingredients to their consumers. To explain to you why this is a policy that should be implemented, I will first argue why a lack of accountability between tampon manufacturers and consumers is a problem. Second, I will explain how we got here. And finally, I will propose a bill that Congress should implement in order to ensure that tampon manufacturers disclose their ingredients. Now, I'm sure you understand why not knowing the ingredients we're putting in or on our body is a problem. They can be harmful or even just irritating. But is this really the case with tampons? Aren't they just made of cotton? Well, technically yes, but more importantly, most are made of non-organic cotton. According to a May 2017 New York Times article entitled "Period Activists Want Tampon Makers to Disclose Ingredients," non-organic cotton is heavily doused with pesticides because it's not a food crop. Now, we know that pesticides have been proven detrimental when used in food crops, which is why they often use only a small amount when it's a non-organic food crop. But since cotton isn't a food crop, it's heavily doused in pesticides, which means we really probably shouldn't be using it in our tampons since it would be ingested into us through the tampon. But not only is non-organic cotton doused in pesticides, it's also bleached with chlorine. According to a July 2016 Time article entitled "The Truth About Your Tampon," dioxin is a chemical that results from chlorine processing, and it is a known carcinogen. According to the World Health Organization, we know how detrimental dioxins are, yet they're found in our tampons. But people that use tampons don't just have to worry about the cotton, they also have to worry about the applicators as well. According to a HuffPost.com article by Dr. Joseph Marcola, chemicals in the tampon applicators alone is a cause for concern. If the tampon applicators are made of plastic, they were most likely made using the chemicals BPA or BPS. These both are known to not only disrupt the development of embryos, but they are linked to heart disease as well as cancer. But what if the applicators aren't made of plastic? What if they're made of paper? Are they safe then? No, because paper applicators are known to be processed using phthalates in order to give them a smooth finish. Phthalates is another plasticizing chemical that is a known hormone disruptor, which means it is also linked to cancer, according to Dr. Joseph Marcola. Although applicators don't stay inside the body for that long like the tampon itself, harmful chemicals in the applicators could still be damaging because of just how absorbent the skin is on the vagina. Comparing the skin of your vagina to the skin to the rest of your body, it's kind of like comparing brands of paper towels. Your skin is absorbent, but the skin in your vagina is way more absorbent, which means that anything that goes in it goes directly into your bloodstream. In an article posted by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, Alexander Scranton, who is the Director of Science and Research for the environmental organization called Women's Voices for the Earth, states that it is well known that the vaginal ecosystem is more sensitive and more absorbent than the skin on the rest of our body. She then goes on to say that in spite of this, there is still very little research on feminine care products, specifically tampons, and how it affects long-term health. This is most likely due to the fact that tampon manufacturers don't have to disclose their ingredients. Now, you may be thinking, okay, so the vagina is way more absorbent than the rest of our skin, but can one tiny tampon really hold that many unsafe chemicals in it and still be sold legally on the market? And you may be right, but considering how many tampons the average person uses in their lifetime, does it really matter? According to a PandiaHealth.com article entitled "The True Cost of Your Period," a person that gets their period gets it around roughly 456 times throughout the span of 38 years. This means roughly 2,280 days are spent on your period. Do you know how many tampons that is? Well, according to this same article, it is over 9,000. Now, let's pretend that this rectangle here is a tampon. What would this look like if it was multiplied by 9,000? It would look like this. So even if one small tampon doesn't hold that many chemicals in it, anything multiplied by 9,000 becomes astronomical. This proves that the health effects of using tampons could really be a ticking time bomb. And the effects can span over your lifetime, so you wouldn't notice them right away. But since there's also very little research backing this up, we really don't know if they would affect our health or not. And this is because we don't know exactly what's in them because tampon manufacturers don't have to disclose their ingredients. I hope you now understand why tampon manufacturers not having to disclose their ingredients is a problem. But now you may be wondering, how did we get here? Well, the FDA does not require tampon manufacturers to disclose ingredients. According to a guidance document on the FDA's website under Menstrual Tampons and Pads, Information for Pre-Market Notification Submissions, the FDA only recommends that tampons be free of toxic ingredients. And this is exactly the phrasing that they use. Here's a screenshot from the same article that I just talked about from the FDA's website. As you can see, it says that it does not establish legally enforceable responsibilities. This proves that we need a systemic change. By the FDA not making requirements for ingredients, manufacturers of tampons are under zero obligation, which leads to less transparency between seller and consumer. Luckily, however, there is a solution. A federal law ensuring that tampon manufacturers disclose their ingredients. Although this may seem like a drastic idea, it really isn't, because bills are already being passed on the state level. According to an October 2019 Forbes article entitled "Cuomo Signs Bill Making New York the First State to Mandate Ingredient Lists for Tampons," New York has already begun the process of ensuring ingredient lists. Through the Menstrual Products Right to Know Act, manufacturers are given until April of this year to properly package their items with the ingredient lists. And if they do not oblige, then their products will not be sold in New York. It's not crazy to want a nationwide mandate, especially if there's already mandates being passed on the state level that are working. Now, how do we know that these pushes for ingredient lists are working? Well, because large tampon organizations are already realizing that they need to shift to safer products. According to a CNN article from May 2019 entitled "Tampax Introduces Its First Organic Tampon," Tampax just recently created a line called Pure that states it's free from dyes, fragrances, and chlorine bleaching. It also uses applicators that are composed of 90% plant-based materials, which means it is most likely free of all those plasticizing chemicals we were talking about earlier. Had there not been a consistent outcry for ingredient lists because of a want for safer products, I don't think this would have happened. This proves that when we use our voices, we can create change. If we fight for a federal law, we can get one. And think about how much change we can make with not just wants, but federal mandates. In conclusion, it's time that we get clear on what's in our tampons, and the best way to do so is to fight for a federal law ensuring the disclosure of tampon ingredients. Through a federally given mandate, we can hold tampon manufacturers accountable and feel secure knowing that we know exactly what's in our body. Without this accountability, we could blindly go about using tampons that are harming us in the long run. And even if tampons are completely safe, we should know for a fact that they are by knowing the ingredients that are in them. Until we know exactly what's in tampons, we won't know what exactly we're putting in us. Even if you don't use tampons, you know at least a dozen people, probably more, that do, that you love and care about. By knowing what they're putting in their bodies, they'll have the opportunity to make safe and educated decisions. This way, they don't need to let a natural and healthy bodily function like menstruation affect their health in the long run. And if you use tampons, neither do you. Thank you.
Hello again. That concludes our public speaking contest. You have now seen all 6 competitors and seen their impressive performances. And so the next step is going to be for you to, after a brief moment, we will be sharing an awards video where we announce who received the awards for the various rankings in this contest. And so we'll announce our 3 honorable mentions as well as our top 3 finalists. And so please stay tuned for that. You should be able to access the link below to see that. And we thank you for joining us for the contest. And maybe we will see you again in the spring when we host yet another rendition of the Civic Engagement Public Speaking Contest. Thank you very much.